The day fire fell from heaven. There was a day in history when an entire nation stood in silence, waiting to see which God was real. On top of a mountain, two altars stood side by side. One belonged to the prophet Elijah. The other belonged to 450 prophets of Baal. Below the mountain stood thousands of people from the nation of Israel. They had gathered to witness something no one had ever seen before. A test, a challenge, a moment that would decide who truly had power. For years, the people had been torn between two beliefs. Some still remembered the God of their ancestors. Others had begun worshiping Baal, a god their king and queen had introduced. The land itself seemed to reflect the confusion. The sky had not given rain for years. Fields were dry. Crops had failed. Rivers were shrinking. The nation was desperate. And in the middle of that crisis, Elijah stood before the people and asked a question that cut through the silence like thunder. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. No one answered. The crowd said nothing. So Elijah proposed something radical. 2 altars would be prepared. 2 sacrifices would be placed on them. But no fire would be lit. Instead, each side would call on their God. And the God who answered with fire from heaven would be proven real. The crowd agreed. The prophets of Baal stepped forward first. Hundreds of them. Confident. Certain. After all, what chance did one lonely prophet have against 450? But before the sun set that day, fire would fall from heaven, and an entire nation would fall to its knees. The morning sun rose slowly over the rugged slopes of Mount Carmel. From the distance, the mountain looked peaceful. But that day, it had become the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations in biblical history. Thousands of people had gathered. Men, women, elders, soldiers. People from across the land of Israel climbed the rocky paths and stood along the slopes, forming a massive crowd around the top of the mountain. They had come to see something they had never witnessed before. A test between gods. For years, the nation had been spiritually divided. Under the influence of their king and queen, Ahab and Jezebel, the worship of Baal had spread across the land. Temples had been built. Altars had been raised. Hundreds of prophets served Baal, claiming he was the god of storms, rain, and fertility. Yet something strange had happened. The sky had remained closed. Rain had not fallen for years. The rivers had shrunk. Fields had dried up. If Baal truly controlled the rain, why had the land become a desert? That question hung in the air as the crowd watched the scene unfold on the mountain. Standing alone near one side of the clearing was the prophet Elijah. His appearance was simple compared to the spectacle across from him. On the other side stood 450 prophets of Baal. They wore elaborate robes and ceremonial garments. Their presence filled the mountain with noise and confidence. 450 voices. Against one. From a human perspective, the outcome seemed obvious. But Elijah had already proposed the challenge. 2 altars would be built. 2 sacrifices would be prepared. No fire would be placed under them. Then both sides would call on their God. The God who answers with fire. Elijah had declared, he is God. The crowd agreed. Even the prophets of Baal seemed confident. After all, Baal was supposed to be the god of thunder and lightning. Surely fire from heaven would be his specialty. So Elijah allowed them to go first. The prophets of Baal began preparing their altar. Large stones were stacked carefully into place. Wood was arranged on top. Then a bull was sacrificed and placed upon the altar. The scene was dramatic. The sun climbed higher into the sky as hundreds of prophets began their ritual. They lifted their voices together and cried out, "O Baal, answer us." Their chants echoed across the mountain. The crowd watched in silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Still nothing happened. No fire. No smoke. Not even a spark. The prophets continued shouting, "O Baal, answer us." Their voices grew louder. Their movements became more frantic. Some of them began dancing around the altar in circles, performing their ritual movements as they called on their God again and again. But the sky remained silent. No thunder. No lightning. No fire. The sun climbed higher toward midday, and the heat of the mountain grew intense. Still the prophets continued their desperate cries. Hours passed. The noise grew louder. The desperation grew deeper. Then something unexpected happened. Elijah began to speak. Standing calmly off to the side, the lone prophet looked at the crowd and then at the prophets of Baal, and he began to mock them. "Shout louder," he called out. "Surely he is a god. His voice carried across the mountain. Maybe he is deep in thought. The crowd began to murmur. Elijah continued. Or perhaps he is busy. Or traveling somewhere. Some people in the crowd began to smile nervously. Then Elijah delivered the final line with biting sarcasm. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. The prophets of Baal were furious. But instead of stopping, they only became more extreme. They shouted louder than before. They danced wildly around the altar. Some of them began cutting themselves with knives and spears, a ritual practice meant to show their devotion and desperation. Blood ran down their arms as they cried out again and again. "O Baal, answer us." But the sky above Mount Carmel remained completely silent. The hours dragged on. Morning turned into afternoon. The crowd watched the chaos unfolding around the altar. 450 prophets, shouting, dancing, bleeding, begging their God to respond. But there was no answer, no voice, no fire. And slowly, something began to change in the crowd. At the start of the day, many had believed Baal would surely respond. But now doubt was spreading. If Baal controlled lightning, why had he not answered? If Baal ruled the storm, why was the sky still empty? The prophets of Baal continued their desperate rituals until exhaustion began to slow them down. Their voices were hoarse, their movements weaker. The altar still stood untouched. And as the sun began its slow descent toward evening, everyone on the mountain realized something. The prophets of Baal had failed. Now it was Elijah's turn. The noise on Mount Carmel slowly faded. For hours, the mountain had echoed with shouting, chanting, and frantic movement from the prophets of Baal. But now their voices were weak, their bodies exhausted, and their altar still stood exactly as it had that morning. Unburned, untouched, silent. The crowd standing across the slopes of Israel could feel the tension shifting. At the beginning of the day, many had believed Baal would surely answer. After all, Baal was supposed to be the god of storms and lightning. But as the afternoon sun moved slowly across the sky, doubt began to grow. Hundreds of prophets had cried out for hours, yet the heavens had remained completely silent. Then the lone prophet stepped forward. Elijah raised his hand and called out to the people, "Come here to me." One by one, the crowd began moving closer. The noise of the prophets of Baal faded into the background as the people gathered around Elijah. What they saw next surprised them. Before Elijah prepared his sacrifice, he walked toward an old, broken altar nearby. It was the altar of the Lord. Long ago, people had used that place to worship the God of their ancestors. But over time, it had been neglected and destroyed. The stones were scattered. The structure was broken. It was a symbol of what had happened to the nation's faith. Instead of building something new, Elijah chose to rebuild what had been forgotten. Slowly and carefully, he began gathering stones. Not random stones. 12 stones. Each stone represented one of the tribes of Israel, the descendants of the patriarch Jacob. Even though the nation had become divided and confused, Elijah was reminding the people of their identity. They were still the people of Israel. They still belonged to the God of their ancestors. Stone by stone, Elijah rebuilt the altar. The crowd watched in complete silence. There was no shouting, no dancing, no dramatic rituals. Just a single man carefully restoring something sacred that had been broken. Once the altar was complete, Elijah arranged the wood on top of it. Then a bull was prepared and placed upon the altar as the sacrifice. At that moment, the scene already felt different from the earlier chaos. But Elijah was not finished. He gave another command that must have confused the crowd even more. "Fill 4 large jars with water," he said. The people looked at one another. Water? In the middle of a drought? Water was precious. For years the land had suffered without rain. Yet Elijah insisted. Servants brought the jars. "Pour it on the sacrifice," Elijah said. They poured the water over the bull and the wood. The liquid soaked the altar. Water ran down the sides of the stones. The crowd watched in confusion. But Elijah spoke again. "Do it again." For more jars were poured. The sacrifice became completely drenched. Water streamed across the altar. Then Elijah said something even more surprising. "Do it a 3rd time." By now the altar was completely soaked. Water filled every crack between the stones. It spilled onto the ground. So Elijah dug a trench around the altar, and the water filled it. The sacrifice was now completely saturated. The wood was wet. The stones were wet. The ground was wet. From a human perspective, Elijah had just made it impossible for the altar to burn. Fire needs dry wood. Yet Elijah had done the exact opposite. He had removed every possible explanation for what was about to happen. If fire appeared now, no one could say it was a trick. No one could say the wood had been secretly prepared. No one could say it was an accident. Everyone on that mountain would know exactly where the fire came from. The sky above the mountain was beginning to change color as evening approached. This was the traditional time for the evening sacrifice. The moment had arrived. The prophets of Baal stood exhausted nearby. Their ritual had failed. Now the entire mountain was watching Elijah. And Elijah did something remarkable. He did not shout. He did not dance. He did not harm himself. Instead, he simply stepped forward and prayed. A calm voice rose above the silent crowd. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel." With those words, Elijah reminded the people of their history. The God he was calling upon was not a new God. He was the same God who had made promises to their ancestors. Elijah continued, "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant." The prophet was not asking for power to prove himself great. He was asking for something greater. He wanted the people to know who the true God was. Then Elijah spoke the final words of his prayer. "Answer me, Lord, answer me. So these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The entire mountain fell into silence. Thousands of people watched the soaked altar, the wet wood, the water-filled trench, and the lone prophet standing beside it. Then suddenly, everything changed. The mountain was completely silent. No wind, no voices, no movement. Thousands of people stood frozen across the slopes of Mount Carmel, staring at the drenched altar in the center of the clearing. The sacrifice was soaked. The wood was soaked. The stones were soaked. Even the trench around the altar was filled with water. From a human perspective, the scene made no sense. Fire could not burn there. Not naturally. Not accidentally. And that was exactly the point. Moments earlier, the prophet Elijah had finished his simple prayer. No shouting. No dancing. No desperate rituals. Just a few quiet words asking the God of Israel to reveal himself. Then it happened. Without warning, a flash of blazing light burst from the sky. Fire fell from heaven. It was not a small flame. It was not a spark. It was a violent surge of divine fire that crashed down onto the altar with overwhelming power. In an instant, the soaked sacrifice ignited. But the fire did not stop there. It burned the wood. It consumed the bull. It devoured the stones of the altar itself. Even the soil beneath the altar began to burn. The flames spread so fiercely that the water in the trench instantly disappeared, evaporated by the heat of the fire. Within seconds, everything was gone. The sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the water, all consumed by the fire that had fallen from heaven. Where the altar had stood just moments before, there was now nothing but scorched earth. A stunned silence swept across the mountain. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then suddenly, something incredible happened. The crowd fell to the ground. Thousands of people dropped to their knees at the same time. Their voices rose together in one powerful cry. "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Again and again, the declaration echoed across the mountain. The people of Israel had seen the truth with their own eyes. No argument. No debate. No confusion. The answer had come directly from heaven. But not everyone on that mountain reacted the same way. Standing nearby were the prophets of Baal. Just hours earlier, they had been shouting confidently, performing elaborate rituals, certain that their God would answer. Now they stood speechless. Their altar had remained cold and silent. Meanwhile, the altar of the Lord had been consumed by fire from heaven itself. The difference was undeniable. At that moment, Elijah knew the confrontation had reached its turning point. He stepped forward and addressed the people. "Seize the prophets of Baal," he commanded. "Do not let any of them escape." The crowd, still overwhelmed by what they had witnessed, immediately obeyed. The prophets of Baal were captured. The influence they had held over the nation was finally broken. For years they had led the people away from the worship of the true God. Now their deception had been exposed in front of the entire nation. But something even more important was about to happen. Because the miracle of fire from heaven was only the beginning. For 3 long years, the land had suffered under a terrible drought. The sky had remained closed. The fields had withered. The rivers had shrunk. People were starving. Animals were dying. And everyone knew who had declared that drought. It was Elijah. Years earlier, Elijah had stood before the king, Ahab, and announced that there would be no rain in the land until the Lord said so. Now the confrontation on Mount Carmel had revealed who truly held power over the heavens. Baal had failed. The prophets had failed. Only the God of Israel had answered. As the sun began to move lower in the sky, Elijah turned toward King Ahab, who had been watching the entire event. The prophet spoke calmly. "Go, eat and drink," Elijah told the king, "for there is the sound of a heavy rain." The words must have sounded impossible. The sky above Mount Carmel was still completely clear. No clouds, no thunder, no wind. Nothing suggested rain was coming. And yet Elijah spoke with absolute certainty, because he understood something the crowd did not yet realize. The fire that had just fallen from heaven was not only a demonstration of power, it was a turning point. The people had acknowledged the true God. Their hearts had begun to turn back. And now the land itself was about to change. But before the rain could fall, Elijah still had one more prayer to pray. The flames on Mount Carmel had already died down. Where the altar had once stood, there was now only scorched earth and drifting smoke. The crowd was still shaken by what they had witnessed. Fire from heaven had answered the prayer of Elijah. For years the people of Israel had lived in confusion. Now the truth had been revealed. The Lord, He is God. Those words still echoed in the minds of the people who had fallen to their knees just moments earlier. But Elijah knew something the crowd did not yet understand. The fire had been the sign. The rain would be the restoration. So Elijah turned toward the king, Ahab, and spoke with quiet confidence. "Go, eat and drink," Elijah said, "for there is the sound of a heavy rain." The words sounded strange, because the sky above the mountain was completely clear. Not a single cloud floated above the land. For 3 long years, the heavens had been closed. No rain had fallen on the fields or the valleys. The rivers had slowly shrunk into thin streams of muddy water. Crops had failed. Animals had died. Entire villages had struggled to survive. And yet Elijah spoke as if the rain had already begun. King Ahab looked toward the sky. Nothing. But after everything he had just witnessed, even the king could not ignore Elijah's words. So Ahab left the mountain to eat and drink as the prophet had said. Meanwhile, Elijah did something very different. Instead of celebrating the victory on the mountain, the prophet quietly walked to the highest point of Mount Carmel. There, he lowered himself to the ground. He placed his face between his knees, and he began to pray. This posture was not one of pride. It was one of deep humility. Moments earlier, fire from heaven had answered his prayer in front of thousands of people. But Elijah understood something important. Miracles were not performances. They were responses from God. So now the prophet prayed again, this time not for fire, but for rain. Beside him stood a young servant who had been traveling with Elijah. After a moment of silent prayer, Elijah spoke to him. "Go and look toward the sea." The servant climbed a nearby ridge and stared out toward the distant horizon where the Mediterranean Sea met the sky. For a moment, he scanned the vast blue emptiness. Then he returned. "There is nothing," the servant said. The sky was still completely clear. But Elijah did not seem discouraged. "Go back," he told the servant. So the young man climbed the ridge again and searched the horizon. Nothing. The sky remained empty. He returned again. Still nothing. But Elijah continued praying. Again he sent the servant. Again the answer came back. Nothing. This happened again, and again, and again. 6 times the servant climbed the ridge. 6 times he returned with the same report. The sky was empty. There were no clouds. From a human perspective, it seemed as if nothing was happening. But Elijah kept praying. Then he sent the servant a 7th time. Once again the young man climbed the rocky ridge and looked toward the sea. For a moment, he saw the same empty sky he had seen 6 times before. But then, something appeared. It was small. So small it would have been easy to miss. A tiny cloud, barely visible against the horizon. It was about the size of a man's hand. The servant stared at it for a moment, unsure if it meant anything. Then he ran back down the slope toward Elijah. "I see a cloud," he said breathlessly. "It is very small, about the size of a man's hand." Elijah immediately stood up. For most people, a cloud that small would mean nothing. But Elijah knew exactly what it meant. The answer had begun. "Go and tell King Ahab," Elijah said. "Harness your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." The servant looked toward the sky again. It still seemed impossible. The cloud was tiny. But within minutes, the sky began to change. The small cloud slowly grew larger. More clouds began forming around it. Darkness started spreading across the sky. The wind began to rise. The warm, dry air that had dominated the land for years suddenly shifted. Then thunder rolled across the mountains. The sky that had been empty just moments earlier now filled with dark storm clouds. And then, rain began to fall. At first it was only a few drops. Then the drops grew heavier. Soon the entire sky opened. Rain poured across the land of Israel. The drought was over. Fields that had been dry for years began soaking up the life-giving water. The rivers would soon rise again. Crops would grow again. Life would return to the land. And all of it had begun with a single prayer on a mountain. But as the storm intensified, something even more surprising happened. King Ahab climbed into his chariot and began racing down the mountain toward the city of Jezreel. Meanwhile, Elijah stood alone on the stormy slopes of Mount Carmel. Then suddenly, the power of the Lord came upon him, and the prophet did something no one expected. He began to run, faster than the king's chariot, through the pouring rain, all the way toward Jezreel. The rain continued pouring over the land of Israel. For the first time in 3 years, the dry soil drank deeply from the sky. Rivers that had shrunk into dusty paths began filling again. The cracked ground softened as the storm swept across the valleys. What had started as a tiny cloud on the horizon was now a powerful storm. Thunder rolled across the hills. Wind rushed through the trees. Rain fell in sheets across the slopes of Mount Carmel. Meanwhile, King Ahab climbed into his royal chariot. The road from Mount Carmel to the city of Jezreel stretched across the land, winding through fields and hills. If the storm continued to grow, the roads could quickly turn into thick mud. So Ahab ordered his horses forward. The chariot wheels began rolling quickly down the mountain road. Rain splashed against the ground as the horses pulled the king away from the mountain where everything had just changed. But someone else was still standing on the slopes. The prophet Elijah. The storm surrounded him. Lightning flashed across the dark sky. Thunder shook the hills. And yet Elijah stood there, watching the rain fall on the land that had suffered for so long. For 3 years, he had carried the message of drought. For 3 years, he had faced threats, danger, and isolation. Now the rain had returned. The confrontation on Mount Carmel had proven the truth. The God of Israel had answered with fire, and now he had answered with rain. But the story was not over yet. As the storm intensified, something extraordinary happened. Scripture says the power of the Lord came upon Elijah. The prophet gathered his robe and tucked it into his belt so he could move freely. Then he began to run, not down a short path, not across a small field. Elijah ran the entire distance toward Jezreel. The distance was nearly 30 kilometers. And somehow, in the middle of a violent storm, the prophet outran the king's chariot. Imagine the scene. The royal chariot racing along the muddy road. Powerful horses pulling the king through the rain. Wheels splashing through water and dirt. And ahead of them, running through the storm, was Elijah, the lone prophet who had just called down fire from heaven. The rain soaked his clothes. Wind whipped across the fields. Thunder rolled across the sky. Yet Elijah kept running, step after step through the storm, toward Jezreel. To many who later heard this story, the moment seemed almost unbelievable, but it carried a powerful message. Elijah was not running because he was afraid. He was running because the moment of victory on Mount Carmel was only the beginning. The nation had witnessed the power of God. The people had cried out, "The Lord, He is God." But the real transformation of the nation still had to unfold. And that next chapter would begin in Jezreel. As the storm raged across the land, Elijah continued running through the darkness. The lights of the city eventually appeared in the distance. The prophet slowed as he approached the entrance of Jezreel. Inside that city lived someone who had not yet heard the full story. Someone powerful, someone dangerous, someone who would react very differently than the crowd on Mount Carmel. Her name was Jezebel, and the moment she learned what had happened on the mountain, everything would change again. The storm had passed. The rain that poured across the land of Israel had restored the fields and rivers. The people had witnessed fire fall from heaven on Mount Carmel. For a moment, it seemed like the entire nation had turned back to God. But the story of Elijah did not end with victory. When the news reached the palace, Queen Jezebel was furious. The prophets of Baal had been defeated. Their influence over the nation had collapsed in a single day. So Jezebel sent a message to Elijah. A threat. "By this time tomorrow, I will make your life like one of theirs." In other words, Elijah would be dead. The man who had stood fearlessly in front of 450 prophets suddenly found himself overwhelmed with fear. Instead of confronting Jezebel, Elijah fled. He ran south, far away from the city of Jezreel, leaving everything behind. The journey carried him deep into the wilderness. The same prophet who had just witnessed one of the greatest miracles in history was now completely exhausted. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. Finally, Elijah collapsed beneath a small desert bush. And there, in the silence of the wilderness, he whispered a prayer that revealed how broken he felt. "Lord, I have had enough. Take my life." It was a shocking moment. The prophet who had called fire from heaven was now asking God to let him die. But instead of rebuking Elijah, God responded with something unexpected. Care. Elijah fell asleep beneath the bush. Then he felt something touch him. An angel had come. "Get up and eat," the angel said. When Elijah opened his eyes, he saw bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water beside him. He ate. He drank. Then he fell asleep again. A second time the angel returned. "Get up and eat," the angel said, "for the journey is too much for you." Strengthened by that food, Elijah traveled deep into the wilderness until he reached a mountain known as Mount Horeb. There he entered a cave. And once again, God spoke to him. "Elijah, what are you doing here?" Elijah poured out his frustration. "I have been very zealous for the Lord," he said. "The people of Israel have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." God then told Elijah to stand on the mountain. Something powerful was about to happen. A violent wind swept across the mountain. It was so strong that it shattered rocks. But the Lord was not in the wind. Then an earthquake shook the mountain. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then a fire appeared. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he covered his face with his cloak and stepped out of the cave. Because in that quiet whisper, he recognized the presence of God. It was a moment that carried a powerful lesson. On Mount Carmel, God had revealed himself through fire from heaven. But in Elijah's moment of weakness, God revealed himself through a whisper. The same God who commands fire and storms is also the God who speaks gently to the weary. Elijah was not alone. He had never been alone. And the mission was not over. God told Elijah that there were still thousands in Israel who had not turned away. The future was still unfolding. And Elijah still had a role to play in it. Because sometimes the greatest miracles are not the fire that falls from heaven, but the quiet voice that reminds us, God is still with us.